Albright.
And tributes are paid to Madeleine Albright, America's first Secretary of State as a woman, who's died at the age of 84. From an immigrant fleeing persecution to America's top diplomat. That was the journey we're remembering today of the former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who's died at the age of 84. Arriving in America in 1948 as a child refugee from Czechoslovakia, she was the first woman to become Secretary of State. President Biden said working with her in the Senate was one of the highlights of his career at the time. Our Washington correspondent Nomi Iqbal looks back at her life.
Madeleine Albright was a trailblazer.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Madam Secretary.
In 1997, she became America's top diplomat, the first female to do so. But her story began outside of America. The daughter of a Czech diplomat, her family fled Prague from the Nazis when she was a year old. A decade later, her family was granted political asylum in the US. Her childhood would go on to shape her views and her policies. On the political stage, Madeleine Albright was the face of US foreign policy during the President Clinton years. She pursued what she called aggressive multilateralism, pushing for intervention in the wars that tore apart Yugoslavia. She was a major influence on US policy in the Middle East, clashing with Saddam Hussein over sanctions on Iraq. He called her a serpent. And so began her use of jewellery to make a diplomatic point, starting with a snake. Russia's President Putin once said he knew what the mood of a meeting would be by looking at her left shoulder. The 84-year-old supported getting other women in higher positions. She backed Hillary Clinton in 2016 with a comment that some considered controversial. She later apologised for it.
Just remember, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other.
Arriving in Europe tonight, President Biden said in a statement that Madeleine Albright was a force and hers were the hands that turned the tide of history. There was also a tribute in the UN from those who have followed in her footsteps.
She left an indelible mark on the world and on the United Nations. Our country and our United Nations are stronger for her service.
Only last month, she warned that if President Putin invaded Ukraine, it would be a historic error. Madeleine Albright was raised in a time when Eastern Europe was in crisis, to only see that crisis return during her final days.
Who's died at the age of 84. Geeta Amar is a political and social commentator in Los Angeles who worked as an aide on the Michael Dukakis presidential election campaign in the 1980s, along with Madeleine Albright, who was his foreign policy advisor. Thank you so much for joining us. Madeleine Albright really broke the mold, didn't she? I mean, after her, there were 3 female secretaries of state. She made a huge difference.
She did make a huge difference, Mark, and she was brassy and she was bold, and it was her brooches that told the story. But you have to realize she didn't break the mold till she was later on in life, after she had been raising 2 young women and her husband had a divorce, and she decided to go back to school, and she became this, shall we say, socialite in Georgetown, holding salons, financing Democrats, and then working on the Dukakis campaign as an advisor, and realizing that she had something to say, and she was going to make sure that when she said it, people were going to take the soundbite. She was a multilateralist, and as you know, she was a strong advocate for Eastern and Western Europe.
Yeah, and it was something that really stood out at the time, wasn't it? And she was given support by President Clinton. But what do you think her personal skills were that got her noticed?
I think it was her savoir-faire. It was her ability to be strong as a woman and make those sound bites available. She had no problem being what they call a talking head on television before diplomats were not appearing. You know, rather than be inside the State Department, she was outside. So that was one of her skills. She was able to talk to people on the other side of the aisle. For example, Jesse Helms. She was able to go to the home of what they call the opposition and have a lovely evening, and then convince him to vote her way in the Senate on a treaty to ban chemical warfare. And this was something that she could do, and that's pure diplomacy when she's able to convince something like that. So she knew when to turn on the charm, she knew when to be tough, and she also knew who her allies were from the beginning. And she didn't let people get in her way. She was known for advocating for other women. It's very interesting that she started off in a small office for Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a national security advisor to President Carter. And then she didn't mind, she had a beautiful home in Georgetown, but being in this cubbyhole and working her way up.
No doubt some would wish she was around now for some of the smooth talking on chemical warfare, which we've been discussing in Ukraine. But just tell me, uncover this female soft power for me, the pins and the other things in her armory.
Well, she always dressed to impress, and we don't like to talk about, we never talk about men's suits, but with her, it was always, as Putin even said, it was her brooches that told, these gorgeous brooches, whether she had on a flag of the country, whether she had on a snake, whether she had on an eagle, and people would do collages and all sorts of, shall we say, before Instagram, photo essays to say what mood was she in. So she had that going for her. It was always a conversation piece. It was an opening for her. So she used that. And she was able to impress with that. But she was a student of diplomacy. It wasn't that she was reading those foreign policy papers. She was reading the briefing books, and she knew how to access power. She knew how to get on the phone at that time. It wasn't like she had to text someone, but get on the phone with those leaders to make important decisions. She was thrilled when Poland, Hungary were able to join NATO, something that, we're having right now with the Ukraine. This meant the world to her, for a woman from Eastern Europe whose father and grandparents actually had been decimated in the Holocaust.
Gita, in one word, how will you remember her?
I would remember her as fierce.
Fearless. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your assessment there of Madeleine Albright, who's died at the age of 84.